The U.S. Federal Reserve has warned that stresses in China's real estate sector could impact the United States and the wider global economy if they first spread to the Chinese financial system. China's heavily indebted real estate sector has been the subject of intense scrutiny of late, particularly the embattled firm Evergrande. In its latest financial stability report, the U.S. Central Bank said the problems in China could lead to a, quote, sudden correction of real estate prices, which would have the potential to hit the Chinese financial system and strain global markets. Now, in China itself, the fate of Evergrande has been a priority for the country's leadership as it embodies a shift in policy away from growth at all costs towards what China's leader Xi Jinping calls common prosperity.
An icon of the crisis, Evergrande, one of China's biggest real estate companies, is crumbling. One reason is increasing state intervention in the company. With Chinese real estate prices going through the roof, Beijing has decided to restrict lending to real estate companies. The idea was to rein in runaway prices and make accommodation affordable again. The government's insistence on tightening regulations has also affected other sectors. For over a year, the Chinese leadership has been introducing new laws and regulations affecting the country's domestic technology platforms. In recent decades, the likes of e-commerce behemoth Alibaba, search engine Baidu, rideshare Didi, and the Tencent messaging platform grew largely unregulated and protected from foreign competition into gigantic conglomerates. Now regulators are restricting the company's market power with a constant string of new data security conditions. Fair competition and consumer protection is the official line behind the moves, but the state, meaning the Communist Party, aims to make sure it controls all the data. The clampdowns haven't dampened foreign direct investment in China so far, though, climbing by 6% from 2019 to 2020 to almost $150 billion.
Let's talk some more about this with Fraser, Howie, China expert and author of Rat Capitalism. He joins me from Singapore. Good to have you on the program, Fraser. Tell us more about what in particular is driving this regulatory frenzy by the Chinese government.
Well, basically, and you alluded to in the report, that the Communist Party, which is the state, they're using the cover of regulation, which is certainly needed in some of these industries. But fundamentally, Xi Jinping sees the Communist Party having a say and having the right to decide matters in every aspect of Chinese life, whether it's individual, whether it's at the social level, whether it's business. And he is remaking China in the image that he wants. And that means interference in regular business practices and certainly in private companies.
Xi Jinping, obviously the country's leader, also has signaled a shift in policy away from growth at all costs towards common prosperity. Fill us in on that.
Sure. Well, I think he's I don't know if he's woken up late, but he's certainly now trying to address some of the questions of inequality in the system that has built up over the 30 years of growth. And so some of his measures may be applauded at a prima facie level, but fundamentally he's turned away from what has made China rich in the past 30 years and has gone back to some degree of state planning. He's going after relatively high-profile targets like the billionaires and demanding that they contribute more to society. And the way he should do that, really, though, is revamp his entire tax structure and property tax structure, etc. But they're much harder to do. So it's much easier to pick off sort of individuals and companies than it is actually to fundamentally change the tax structure underpinning the economy.
But if tech companies are to provide schooling platforms for poorer children, if food delivery service are obliged to pay minimum wage to their riders, isn't that a good thing?
Of course it's a good thing. And again, these are not necessarily in conflict at all with sort of good business practices, treating workers with dignity and paying them for a job that they do. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But the point is that it's for the state to decide, or the state to provide education, not for private companies to do so, not for private companies to be a fill-up to basically the failures of the state. And over the past 30 years, the Communist Party has largely forgotten about the countryside. While there's been some movement towards helping the countryside, it has got relatively poorer compared to the cities and the urban middle classes, which have got a lot richer. So it's ultimately failings of the state, which he's now turning on the private sector to make up for.
Fraser, to what extent will this shift in policy affect foreign companies doing business in China?
Well, look, it's definitely going to affect foreign companies. How exactly, we can't really tell. But what we do know is the past 30 years are not a good guide for what the next sort of 30 years will be, or even in the shorter term. And if any foreign company somehow thinks that they can avoid the politics of China or avoid some of these directives, then I'm sorry to say that they're mistaken.
Fraser Howie, China expert and book author, thank you for your thoughts. And staying with China's state policy, the country's leader Xi Jinping promised to make China carbon neutral by 2060. However, China is currently suffering its severe electricity shortage in more than a decade. Experts fear that the world's biggest carbon emitter could be relying too much on fossil fuels for too long.
This used to be one of the dirtiest steel mills in China. Today it's part of an amusement park. 11 years ago, the Beijing municipal government decided that there was no more room in the city for heavy industry.
In the past, there were particles falling on the windowsill like a layer of ash. Now that's changed. As soon as they closed the factory, the air quality got better. The skies are blue again, and even in our home, the environment feels better. Since the factory moved outside the city, the air in Beijing is much fresher, and our blue skies and white clouds have been restored. The weather feels crisp in autumn.
Still, the world's biggest carbon emitter has a long way to go to achieve a greener future. In the short term, China is even falling back on coal and other fossil fuels. Since September, many provinces have been suffering a severe electricity shortage.
Well, I've been here on and off since the early 80s, and that is by far the biggest crisis I've seen. We had blackouts in the late 90s, we had serious gas problem in 2016, but this is the biggest energy crisis that took place in China in this century. And it's going to sustain with us. It's going to be there until, I would say, at least spring next year.
Just in the southern province of Guangdong alone, more than 100,000 factories have had to shut down temporarily. Many of them are now relying on diesel-fueled generators for electricity. Still, Jörg Wuttke is convinced that the green energy transition and business growth can go hand in hand.
Renewable is a big topic in China, and they installed many gigawatt in wind and solar, and renewable for them is also nuclear, by the way. But you don't get more than 9 or 10% of the entire energy mix out of renewables. Coal just rules supreme. 70% of generated electricity is coming out of coal.
But that will have to change soon. Last September, President Xi Jinping promised that China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060. That would be the biggest emissions reduction of any single country in history.
I don't think it was a breakthrough yet. It was a step in the right direction. So I think that these targets and this holistic approach, I think, is the right way to put it. Also because they will need to mobilize the different sectors of society.
China's leadership has made its commitment to climate neutrality clear. What's still lacking, however, is a concrete plan on how to achieve that goal.
Let's take a look now at some of the other business stories making headlines around the world. Chinese property developer Kaisa says it needs more time to meet its financial obligations. The ailing company wants to sell properties in Shanghai and Shenzhen and use the proceeds to help repay its debt. Among Chinese developers, Kaisa is the second largest issuer of dollar bonds after Evergrande. Japan's Softbank group plunged to a net loss of $3.5 billion in the July-September quarter, largely because of declines in its China investments. Its vision fund includes e-commerce giant Alibaba and ride-hailing firm Didi, which have been hit by Beijing's crackdown on tech firms.